There was a billionaire named Emmanuel Asante. He lived behind tall gates of glass and concrete in a part of the city where drivers checked their mirrors twice and security cameras recorded every step. His name appeared in magazines, in invitations printed on glossy paper, in the polite applause of boardrooms. He wore suits that fit like armor and collected watches that told other people what time of success looked like. Yet inside the master suite of his penthouse there was a photograph folded under a pile of cufflinks that did not belong to his public image. The picture was small and faded, but it held a face that would break the quiet of a poor neighborhood and change the course of 2 lives forever. From the outside, it looked like any classic power story, but the danger and the betrayal lived in a room no camera could follow. The voice that will tell this tonight should be grave, observant, and quietly outraged. Let the music swell softly at the opening, the camera drift past gates and cars, then cut to a dim bedroom light. If you are not subscribed yet, consider joining us to see this truth revealed. Now we begin with the life Emmanuel built and the secret he could not hide. The city called him generous. It also called him untouchable. But a chance discovery would show that wealth does not erase guilt. The scene smelled like cologne and old paper. The light in the photograph seemed softer than the bulbs in the room. The narrator took a tone of slow urgency and ironic sympathy as the story moved forward. It started on a humid Tuesday morning when a young woman from the other side of town carried her mother in her mind and her broom in her hand. Emmanuel had a public marriage that looked immaculate. His wife, Lydia, arrived at charity galas in gowns that caught the flash and laughed in photographs that were cropped for newspapers. The couple hosted dinners with roast meat and elaborate fruits, and their address was a status line for invitations and favors. Television anchors used their names as shorthand for success. Neighbors whispered when they saw the gate open and the sleek cars leave at dawn. The penthouse had marble floors that reflected light like a polished lie. The living room smelled of lemon polish and of the invisible hands that kept everything arranged. On the surface, nothing ever broke. Yet those who watched more closely noticed small slips. A waiter in a private club, Malik, mentioned a tense conversation in the elevator. A neighbor named Abena heard Lydia practicing a laugh late at night. A housekeeper named Joseph once found a drawer with envelopes and receipts that did not match public donations. Posts online showed a smiling couple, but the camera cannot read the lines that frown the way people do when they are thinking of escape. The city applauded, and Emmanuel took the applause like proper music. People called his marriage a model. Those who swept the floors and changed the linens knew a different rhythm. The tone for these scenes should feel glossy yet brittle, with sensory notes of polished wood, clinking glass, distant traffic, and the metallic taste of unspoken words. Behind closed doors, the marriage emptied out slowly. Rooms cooled as conversations thinned. On certain nights, Lydia would stand by the window in perfume and stare past the skyline as if looking for a sound she had forgotten. Emmanuel, always precise, kept himself busy with deals and flights and meetings attended by men in dark suits. In private, he was not cruel at once, but indifferent in a way that corrodes trust. Lydia tried to fill the silence with gifts and invitations, with well-staged dates and elaborate apologies offered in the language of things. Her attempts became rituals that only highlighted how small words and hands had grown. Emmanuel listened with a distracted expression and an index finger tapping a pen. Small injuries accumulated like dust on a shelf. Their marriage showed signs of fracture: a missed anniversary, a glass of wine left untouched, a door closed a little too loudly. The domestic resentments were not dramatic at first. They were the quiet kinds that eat at sleep. The house smelled of coffee turned cold, of perfumes layered like armor, of heating oil from the laundry room, and of the metallic scent of a will to survive worn thin. In a neighborhood called East Ridge, gossip traveled fast. A local barber named Kojo would later tell a reporter that he had seen Lydia arrive alone at an event with eyes that seemed not to match her dress. The emotional neglect formed a pressure that invited something darker to nest. The narrator should move with a patient anger, letting the listener feel how proximity without warmth becomes its own danger. Across the river, in a cramped compound with corrugated roofs and a single streetlight, lived Fatima. She had left her village at 17, carrying a single photograph of her mother and a promise to pay for treatment in the city. Her first years were work and waiting. She became a domestic worker, known for exacting care and a gentle voice. Her backstory contained 3 distinct sweeps of hardship and hope. First, she had been a child of smoke and single rooms, used to waking to kettle whistles and the distant cry of goats. Her mother, Amina, had taught her to sew and to make herbal remedies from leaves in a yard no one else valued. Second, she left the village to earn money because the clinic in the regional town said the illness would grow without care. She worked markets by day and hospital corridors by night, stacking pamphlets and holding hands of old patients who smelled of antiseptic. Third, she learned city etiquette step by step, trading a life of scarcity for the cautious stability of paid work. Fatima kept a small locket with her mother's picture clasped inside cloth. It was the only artifact of a life that otherwise felt borrowed. She slept poorly for years because worry had a shape. She sent money home and visited the clinic where Dr. Ajoa sometimes scratched notes on paper and said they were doing what they could. Fatima's backstory is simple and human, each sentence carrying the sensory memory of dust, smoke, soap, and the warmth of a hand that never told lies. She joined Emmanuel and Lydia's household after an agency interview where she showed a quiet competence and a soft laugh. She did not anticipate being the fulcrum between secrets and justice. Her first days in the mansion were full of small observations. She learned the morning routine, the soft beep of the elevator, the clink of plates, the heavy curtains that smelled faintly of lavender. She noticed things others had taken for granted. She found a key hidden in the glove compartment of a car parked in the basement and a ledger tucked inside a book whose spine had been peeled. She heard Lydia arguing on the phone with a voice trembling while cutting vegetables, and she saw Emmanuel sign documents with a bandage on his thumb where ink had rubbed raw. Fatima became attentive in ways that were more than job training. She learned to read silences. She developed a genuine care for Emmanuel in the way a nurse might care for a patient who is not yet dead but who needs steadiness. She polished his watches, learned which cup he preferred in the morning, which tea eased his stomach. Her small acts of kindness made Lydia uncomfortable in a way that grew into watchful disdain. One afternoon, Lydia said, "You are careful with him." Fatima replied quietly, "I care for the people I work with." Lydia laughed with a brittle edge. Careful is a word we use for things we want to hold on to. Their exchanges increased in tension and frequency. In the staff room, Fatima spoke with Joseph and Malik about the late comings of a car that idled in the drive most nights. Joseph said, "That is Dr. Menza visiting." Malik shrugged and added, "Or so we hear." Abina, the neighbor, dropped by once and left with a look that seemed to ask questions she would not voice. Fatima kept her mother's picture hidden in her apron pocket and often smelled its paper like a remedy. The sensory notes in these scenes include the metallic clink of keys, the soft thud of footsteps on carpet, the smell of tea and lemon oil, the whisper of silk, and the chill of a room where people pretend warmth. Suspicion began to gather when Fatima found the small photograph tucked inside a book on a shelf in the master bedroom. It was her mother, Amina. She carried the image to the pantry and sat on a crate with her knees pulled up. The photograph was marked in a corner with a hospital stamp from a clinic in a town she had left 10 years earlier. Her throat tightened, and the air in the small pantry felt thin. She could hear the distant hum of the elevator like a slow pulse. She debated what to do. The first moment of tension arrived then, and it felt like a quiet choke. She could put the picture back and keep the secret, or she could take a step that would remake everything. The moment held the smell of dust and boiled water, and it tasted like iron on the tongue. Fatima chose to photograph the image on her phone and to send it anonymously to a reporter she trusted, a woman named Nana Essien who worked for a small but principled outlet. That decision was a moral fork. The inner voice that had kept her sewing and sending money home urged silence, while another voice urged truth. The scene was thick with sensation, the cool paper under her thumb, the glow of her phone screen, the weight of air-conditioned rooms above her head. This first attentive act set off a chain that could not be rewound. Fatima and Emmanuel began to occupy the same dangerous orbit. Emmanuel noticed small changes. He asked his driver Kojo one evening, "Who brought the casserole?" Kojo replied, "It was Fatima." Emmanuel said, "She manages the household well." Their dialogue was quiet, almost clinical. Later he would ask Lydia, "Do you trust our staff?" Lydia said, "We pay them. Trust is different." Emmanuel answered, "And yet trust is what keeps a house whole." Their exchanges were brief but edged like glass. The second major moment of tension arrived when whispers of Amina's photograph began to trace back through a network. Lawyer Mensah received a message that mentioned a connection between Emmanuel and a clinic fund that had sent patients away. Inspector Kofi of the local precinct noted a request for a records search. A man named Ya, a former partner in a small company that had lost a contract to Emmanuel, began circulating rumors. The household atmosphere thickened as if with storm humidity. There were instances of sensory detail that painted the growing unease. Lydia burning her mouth on hot tea while reading an email. Emmanuel running a hand over his temple while the television played a charity gala. Fatima tasting salt on her lips from a dish she had prepared in hurry and thinking of the clinic that once treated Amina. Conversations increased in frequency and heat. In the staff room, Joseph said, "Maybe it is nothing." Malik said, "Nothing does not have a photograph." Abena overheard a phone call that mentioned a name she had never heard. Each small exchange piled onto the next until the structure began to groan. The conspirators began to reveal themselves. A discreet lover, a man named Daniel Boteng, who worked in Emmanuel's investments and had access to private schedules, had been seen slipping into the building late. A woman named Sandra, who had managed Lydia's social calendar, sent messages that read like gentle manipulations. The clues formed a map. Fatima found a receipt with Daniel's handwriting. Malik mentioned a bottle of tea that had been requested to be steeped longer than usual. Daniel met with Sandra at a cafe and spoke in quiet sentences that landed like stones. Sandra said, "We need a solution." Daniel said, "There will be no trace if we are careful." Their conversation contained the particular scrape of cutlery on porcelain, the smell of roasted coffee, the shiver of a chair pulled too quickly from a table. This third moment of tension shows deceptive calm. The duplicity smelled like jasmine perfume and solvent. Fatima, listening at the top of the staff stair with a hand pressed to her chest so hard she could feel the pulse of fear, overheard a phrase that made her hands go numb. She returned to the pantry, counted breaths, and resolved to gather proof. On the night the plan moved toward execution, the mansion felt like a living organism holding its breath. The tea was prepared for Emmanuel after a late board meeting. Fatima had prepared the cup because she knew his routine. She had polished the rims, warmed the mug with steaming water, and placed the tea bag in at a precise time. In the pantry she heard subtle footsteps, the click of a lighter, the quiet murmur of voices in another room. There were 8 to 10 direct exchanges in the sequence that would decide life or death. Daniel said, "Did you place it?" Sandra answered, "Yes, I did it while she was distracted." Daniel said, "No one will suspect a cup of tea." Sandra said, "She notices things." Daniel said, "That is why we are careful." Fatima, overhearing hidden by the door, whispered to herself, "I cannot let this happen."
She moved through the shadows, smelling the tea steam and the faint chemical of something foreign. She pushed the cup back toward the counter, replaced it with an identical mug, and slipped the poisoned cup into a drawer for safekeeping. The tension in this moment was sensory and immediate. A hot ceramic surface against her palm, the metallic edge of the kitchen counter biting her wrist, the whisper of fabric as she crouched, the distant sound of the elevator returning, and the taste of bile at the back of her throat with the knowledge she had just intercepted a plan. The dialogue in the confrontation that followed was sharp. Emmanuel walked in and asked, "Why is this cup here?" Fatima said, "I thought you preferred iced water after meetings." He frowned, "You should not rearrange my things." She replied, "You should not be a target." He blanked, "A target?" She spoke louder, "Someone tried to poison you." He laughed in disbelief. "Poisoned? By whom?" Fatima answered, "I do not know yet, but I have a photo, and I will not stand by." Her confession had the
weight of a scream held in silence. After the interception, there was panic, then a professional response. The household called their private doctor, Dr. Ajoa, who arrived with medical calm and a smelling of antiseptic and leather from his bag. He examined Emmanuel, listened to his breath, and ordered tests. Promises were made in low tones. Inspector Kofi arrived with a polite knock and a bag from the station. The police procedure that followed would be described clinically with a measured voice and specific details in about 300 characters. Officers sealed the scene, cataloged the cup with numbered tags, took swabs for toxicology, secured handwriting samples, and logged statements from staff into formal reports. A forensic team from the district laboratory took the sample to a cold chain and ran mass spectroscopy and chromatography to identify alkaloids and uncommon agents. The lab work smelled of solvents and blue light, of centrifugal hum, and the soft click of glass against metal. Tests confirmed a toxic compound in the tea that matched a pharmaceutical used in regional clinics but not sold in stores. The confirmation made the case urgent. Messages circulated between lawyer Menza and a legal team that Emmanuel had called, while Nana Essien prepared to publish a cautious piece based on the anonymous photograph Fatima had sent. Arrests followed. Daniel was taken out of his car by officers wearing plain shirts and reading him his rights. Sandra was found alone in a cafe and escorted to the station. Lydia was brought in for questioning, not as a suspect initially, but as someone who had motive and access. The press arrived, cameras creating a crackling noise like distant insects. Lawyer Menza entered with measured steps and a leather briefcase. He spoke to the cameras once. "We will cooperate with the investigation." Inspector Kofi read charges and secured evidence. There were witnesses. Kojo, the driver, gave a statement. Abena, the neighbor, detailed late-night conversations she had heard. Joseph and Malik provided timelines from the house, and Dr. Ojoa supplied medical files. The legal process became a public stage. The narrative voice here should balance outrage with clarity, describing court preparation, subpoenas, and the role of testimony. The courtroom itself smelled of old wood, wax polish, and the metal of the gavel. Evidence was presented: the photograph, the hospital stamp, bank transfers that mapped payments to Daniel, messages from Sandra discussing an alibi, and a lab report confirming the toxin. The judge set a trial date, and the city murmured. Accusations were read, and the defense prepared to argue manipulation and lack of intent. The trial would become a lens on power and vulnerability. The trial was long and bitter. Witnesses took the stand with a mixture of courage and fear. Nana Essien read a message she had received. Fatima gave her statement with a voice that trembled but did not break. There were heated exchanges in court, with attorneys debating motives and methods. Lawyer Menza argued that Emmanuel had enemies in business and that the case required due testing. The prosecution put forward the chain of custody and the lab findings. A prosecution witness, Dr. Mensa from the toxicology lab, explained how trace compounds pointed to a specific source, a compound similar to a sedative used in some clinics that could cause a patient to fall into coma if mixed incorrectly.
A neighbor, Abena, testified to seeing Daniel enter the building the night the cup was prepared. The defense tried to undermine Fatima, suggesting she had motives connected to money or attention. In cross-examination, Emmanuel himself admitted confusion and a private regret over how distant he had allowed his home to become. The judge listened with a face carved of patient stone. The verdict leaned on the weight of evidence. The jury found Daniel and Sandra guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, and they were remanded into custody. Lydia faced charges of accessory after the fact, and a civil suit began to move through courts. The public felt a tremor as wealth and spectacle collided with ordinary courage. The epilogue unfolded in 3 moments and stretched long enough to let consequences settle and to show what justice and healing might look like. 1 month after the verdict, Emmanuel had lost small things and large ones. Publicly, he was a man whose name was now bound to scandal. There were fewer invitations. He walked through rooms that had been keepers of his choices and found the photographs and handwritten notes that showed a life he had let slip. Fatima returned home to East Ridge with caution and quiet pride. People at the market now nodded as she passed, and a woman named Marjorie brought her a plate of stew. She still refused most interviews, but agreed to talk with Nana Essien again and to speak about the clinic that had treated her mother. The town clinic offered an apology in a statement and promised a review of patient records. Emmanuel agreed to pay for a more thorough investigation into clinic practices and to fund a small scholarship in Amina's name. 3 months later, the legal reverberations expanded. Civil suits were filed to recover damages. Lydia faced both public condemnation and a separate civil claim from Emmanuel for betrayal and manipulation of household resources. The community organized a fundraiser for the families affected by the clinic errors. Lawyer Mensa provided pro bono advice to help Fatima set up a small fund to assist patients needing travel to regional hospitals. The mansion remained for sale in some listings as people debated whether riches could ever buy back trust. Fatima visited her village briefly and held her mother's picture to her chest at the cemetery where a wind smelled of earth and boiled leaves. 6 months on, the city began to look different in small ways. The local police introduced better procedures for cases that bridged private homes and public safety. The forensic lab published a paper on chain of evidence protocols
that cited the trial as a case study and recommended stricter controls on certain pharmaceutical distributions. Fatima had used the fund to pay for 2 neighbors' treatment plans and enrolled in a certificate course in health administration so she could advocate for better patient records. Emmanuel spoke to a small group at a community center about the loneliness of power and the need to listen. He looked smaller than he had in magazines. The final moment of epilogue showed that justice had not been perfect or total, but it had redirected life. Daniel and Sandra served sentences, and their appeals were denied. Lydia accepted a plea in a civil settlement and retreated from public life to seek counseling. Fatima chose routine and quiet work rather than fame. The community learned to name courage when they saw it and to support the small acts that stop harm. The closing voice should be steady and reflective, reminding the listener that truth often arrives wrapped in unlikely hands, and that every person choosing to act becomes part of a fragile and real justice. If this story moved you, if you felt the sting of righteous rage or the relief of accountability, leave a comment below and tell us what you would have done if you had found that photograph. Write simply, "I would tell someone," or "I would stay quiet," and explain why. The community will read your responses, and they help us shape future conversations about courage and responsibility. Subscribe for more stories where ordinary people bring truth into light. At the end, remember this: wealth cannot hide a photograph, and silence cannot hide a conscience. The truth, when held by a poor girl's steady hand, felt brutal and necessary, and it changed more than a name on a gate.